there's lots of issues we can bring up about how we can do this work, differently and better. So.
Hello, I'm John from Broadsheet, and you're very welcome to the 18th in a series of shows on the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation report. We're joined as ever by Breda Murphy, tune campaigner, adoptee advocate and activist Ewan Duffy, and we're joined by, sadly, Frank Breheny, lawyer Frank Breheny will not be able to join us tonight, but we'll be back next week. But we are very, very honoured to be joined by Laura McTackney. Laura, did I get that right?
Yes, that was right. Very good.
Okay. Dr. Laura is at Aarhus University in Denmark. Where is that? It's in the middle of our street. And an archaeologist, but a very unique archaeologist in the sense that it's not just the physical structure and it's the people who live there. And you've done work not just in Long Kesh, but also at Magdalen Laundries, the one in Donnybrook. Good evening, Laura.
Hello, thank you for having me on. I'm really delighted to talk to you all, especially about this work, because it's something I'm really passionate and excited about.
Breda, I'm going to make you host, so you're going to share some of the images that you've collected over the years with your work. So you're now the host. Okay, Laura, perhaps you could talk us through the Magdalen project first, and then we can go to the sort of island of Ireland.
Sorry, can I come in? Is Laura the host? Because I don't know how to host this, John.
Yeah, Laura is the host.
Oh yeah, great.
Yeah, would you like to be the host?
No.
I think Breda.
Yeah, I thought I seen the same. Breda was the host. Yeah.
No.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry.
No.
Perhaps, are you the host now, Breda? Are you?
Yeah, and I don't want to be, John.
Make me the host again, or make Laura the host.
Yeah, fine.
Okay. Is Laura the host now? I'm terribly sorry for this.
I don't.
You'll have to make me the host again, I'm afraid.
And how do I, John? I'm sorry, I don't know how.
No problem. It'll. If you go up to your little avatar and just click, it'll give you a sort of options.
I can't.
No problem.
Sorry, John.
No problem at all.
I think if you click on the participants at the bottom, then it'll bring them up at the side. And if you go over to either my name or John's name, there's a button up that says more. And if you click on it, it's in the list there.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not that intuitive.
John, you're back at.
Yes.
I'm the host now. Great.
Thank you, Laura.
And thank you, Breda. I'm now going to make Laura the host. So the Magdalen Laundries in Donnybrook. Tell me about that project.
Okay.
Share with us.
So so I've known about the work with Magdalen Laundries, obviously, for a long time. It's had a lot of public profile, but I worked with Catherine O'Donnell, who's, famous for being in Justice for Magdalens. She was my mentor when I did a project in UCD, which was about recording graffiti in Kilmainham jail. So it was focused on finding women's stories from the Civil War, essentially. So she knew me, I knew her, and I knew she was doing work at that time, collecting oral histories for Magdalen survivors. And I worked in the same office as some of that was going on. So I always had an interest, and I always wanted to find a way of being able to do some work as an archaeologist there. So as you know, my archaeology work is a little different against most people's. I don't excavate that much. I've mainly studied standing buildings and mainly things from the recent past. So the first big project I did was on the Maze prison, which was obviously the prison that held most prisoners from the Troubles. And it had only closed in 2001, and I started working in 2004 in it. So it's obviously a site that was still materially intact and still had a lot of people alive who were associated with it. So in some ways that gave me angles into how to think about working with Magdalen Laundries, which are, you know, sites that were, some of them were quite intact, and there was a lot of people alive. So in terms of being an archaeologist, it wasn't just about the stuff, but how do we incorporate people and their stories into it as well. So I was asked in 2018 to consult with the developers who owned Donnybrook. At the time, they had just been rejected for a planning process to redevelop the site. And they were going through the processes of getting other archaeologists to do work there. So they were scanning the floors to see if there was any disturbances underneath, to see if there were bodies. Which, to be honest, when I seen the site, I knew they probably wouldn't find them because it was a very discreet site. It was only really the industrial buildings left. So, you know, it wasn't like a large site like some of the other, like Hyde Park or Sean McDermott Street, because it had been sold off in the early 90s by the nuns to a private developer. So it was one of the only sites that kept working as a laundry for a long time after it had been in Magdalen. So I was brought in 2018, and they asked me if I would come over and consult with them from Denmark to tell them, you know, how they might approach the site differently. Because the archaeologists in Dublin City Council had rejected their proposal because they hadn't done enough archaeologically. And so they give me some of the reports that have been written by other archaeology, you know, contractors, because academic archaeologists are different from contract archaeologists. We work in different sectors and do slightly different things. So there's crossover, but it's not quite the same. And I was known for working with standing buildings in the recent past. So I had a slightly different way of engaging with it than people who were working in contracts. So I seen the reports they had written, and I noticed that they kept talking about the important social histories of these buildings, but they were still looking at the sites in terms of how Irish archaeologists traditionally work with, you know, sites that are archaeologically important, which is the idea that they are materially very old and that they have some kind of inherent importance in the materials, where actually the sites were important because of the social histories and because of what happened in them, not because of the actual buildings themselves didn't make them particularly important. So they wouldn't be kept or preserved because of the actual materials, but because of the stories. So that's what I recommended to them, was that we didn't just focus on the industrial remains, but actually the site was very intact. There was a lot of stuff still there, like very, very full. It had been almost like it had been abandoned a few years before. So in the McAleese report, it was supposed to have closed, I think, around 2012, maybe a bit before that. But we found evidence that was still being used quite a bit after that, like up to 2016, 17, there were still posts and there was calendars and things like that that showed it was still being used to some degree. So longer than the paperwork trail said. And there was just a lot of stuff there that was definitely from the Magdalen period. It wasn't, you know, from the period afterwards. So my advice to the developers was that they had to get someone who was a specialist in recording buildings and recording their remains, that was going to move beyond just looking at it as a kind of material site that was important. But how do we include the stories of the women? How do we include the stories to do with the religious nature of the building, not just the industrial nature? Because previously it was just seen as, let's record all the machines and that will do it. And what I focused on was, how do we work with survivors to actually get their stories of the site? So not just sitting in a room with them and asking them to tell us things that happened to them, but actually walking around the site and seeing how being in the site brought different memories. So it was still archaeological because it was about the material, you know, the kind of material remains. And actually what I found, and this is what I did in the Maze prison as well, is that people have totally different memories by being somewhere as they would do out of it. Like, it can be re-traumatizing as well. And that's something I was really conscious of, and something I talked to the women about beforehand and showed them pictures of the site, because I didn't want it to be such a big shock, but it still is. Like, you just can't avoid that. But, and that's why also, you know, we try to spend some time afterwards, you know, let's go and have a tea and a scone was what we did, and like have a decompress after. And then I met them the next day and we had, you know, breakfast or lunch or whatever, you know, just to try and think through how they felt about being on the site. And I tried to do it in as unobtrusive way as possible, that we walked around together and that I just had a microphone. I didn't film them because I actually had been filmed on Longkesh site, and a part of a big project that was done about pretty much filming people who had a connection to it. And I found it very hard to, like, you know, engage with the site when you had a camera in your face. So I was really conscious not to do that to, you know, any of the survivors who came in. And yeah, like it was a really powerful experience. It was actually, and I'm sure it was very difficult for the survivors. I felt it was quite difficult too, because it was quite powerful being there with them and just seeing their reactions to different parts of the site. But what we wanted was that to become part of the archaeological process, was actually to include their stories, not to have it separate, not to have it's all about objects. You know, sometimes we actually only identified what some of the objects were because the women were able to tell us stories about them, because it wasn't obvious why they were important or why they were there. I can show you pictures if you're interested of some of the
Please,
stuff.
Laura, that's great, thank you. What era would the women have been at the laundry? The ones who you showed around there?
So I only spoke to a small number of women, because for a number of reasons we didn't really want to publicize what was happening, because you can get a whole influx of people, and sometimes people who aren't actually survivors or, you know, feel a connection to the site. And I think, you know, Justice for Magdalene's had issues with sometimes having, you know, kind of people who, you know, who felt the connection to it but actually didn't have a background there. And so they asked people who they knew had been on the site who might be open to having those discussions, because they had openly talked about their stories before. So I only work with 2 women, and also it was because it's got no electricity in the site. It's really cold and dank. I mean, there was rats and stuff in there. So we did only want to do it in the summer when it wasn't really cold and wet and everything else. So I did in August and September in 2018, I did 2 separate little recording exercises. And it was really also a bit of a pilot project, because I'd really like to do it in Sean McDermott Street as well, is to, you know, speak to more women. So they were mainly there from a good bit earlier, from the 60s and maybe the 70s. Actually, it was interesting that neither of them talked about the exact dates. And one of my roles was not to direct them. I didn't want to ask them questions. I wanted them to react to the site. So sometimes, you know, they wouldn't talk about stuff that maybe you really wanted to know, but that wasn't the purpose, was for me to ask them lots of questions, because then that, you know, takes away from their reactions. But I knew one of the women was definitely there in the 60s, and I think both of them were probably there at that time. And they weren't there for very long periods of time, for weeks and months, not for years.
Okay.
And they were both quite young as well when they'd been in there. So they had a long period afterwards of not having been.
And do they describe their daily routine?
It was interesting, actually. People reacted differently. So when I show you some of the pictures, you'll probably understand this.
Yeah.
I'll maybe put them up now just so you can see them. But it was in a really bad state of repair. So I think it was quite shocking. And because of the ruin, it really affected how their memories, I think, were, you know, formed of it, which I can totally understand. It wasn't something I'd really thought about at the time. So I'll just put this picture up here. I had a number of themes that I kind of ended up thinking about as I was trying to figure out how to make sense of everything. And one of them was about the messiness of it, like just how disrupted it was by ruin, and also because archaeologists had been in there digging, they had left a lot of debris behind, which was actually quite disconcerting, because it was often almost grave-shaped lumps in the ground of like rubble that had been taken out. And that was quite weird to see whenever you first went in. But essentially the inside of the main structure was like in disarray. There was a lot of stuff had been moved around, and some of this was by the most recent owners because they were trying to clear stuff out of the site. It had obviously been used as a bit of a dumping ground from people in the local area. There was a lot of boxes from TVs and stuff like that, which then became dangerous because if fires were set off in there, then it would have, potentially been a fire hazard. So that was one of the reasons they also asked me to come in, was to tell them what they would be allowed to throw away, so they weren't throwing away anything important. But things like these, laundry containers were obviously from the period of the Magdalenes. There was a lot of stuff like all moved in together. Some stuff was fairly obviously recent, some stuff was a lot later, but the place, as you can see, there's like big lumps of paint on some of the walls. There's vents were falling down, so it was quite disrupted, and it would have looked quite different from when the women were in there, when it was much more ordered and much more structured in how they would have been there. And one of the things they were also interested in was the sites they weren't allowed to go to. So they'd never been in the office space. They'd never been in any of the administration areas. So they were kind of wanting to see what that looked like. So it wasn't like they could tell me a lot about it, but, you know, part of the process is for them to get closure as well. So they got to see what they, you know, we went where they wanted to go, essentially.
Was this was that a room where a laundry room or?
This was the main, this was actually the part of the building that was added latest in the 90s. So it was added slightly after they had actually sold, it had been sold as a laundry. So this was the main sorting room where they would have done a lot of the folding of the clothes and things like that. And actually, you can't really see this, but at the very back of the room, there was a big sorting container where they would have sorted different types of materials. And actually, there was quite a lot of you know, white linens just still there, which was interesting because there was discussions about, you know, should we keep these? But obviously they're not from the time of the Magdalen laundry, but you still look at laundry and you think, you know, should we be keeping laundry as well? So there was a lot of old machines under the staircases, and it was interesting as well. You could see a lot of blocked up doorways and things because whenever that building had been connected to the convent next door, those had all been blocked up whenever it had been sold. So there was a lot of like disruption, and a lot of old machines that, you know, were definitely again from the period when it would have been used as a Magdalen, but it was all dumped on top of each other. You know, things that got in there, lots of birds and rats and everything. So there was a lot of debris from animals. Things like this, which was a bit random, like someone had just poured a bag of like Benson and Hedges cigarettes, like someone had been smoking in vast quantities all over a floor. I think there was a caretaker who had very specific taste in cigarettes and in coffee. So there was the same coffee bars all over the place as well, which is a bit weird. And actually really freakily the same as my dad. He like golden blend coffee and Benson and Hedges cigarettes. So it was quite strange seeing them.
Benson's one myself. Sorry.
So it was like very disrupted, and that actually I found kind of interesting just in terms of even studying it. It was still part of the story of the site, was like how it was left as well.
Yeah. How many staff were there? Wow.
Yeah, and so these old blue tables would have been original. This color of blue, you know, turns up quite a lot, and it turned up in Sean McDermott Street as well. So I think it was a lot of the tables you could tell were handmade, and there was an old workroom still there, which was full of, you know, old bits of equipment that obviously had been there for decades too. So quite a lot of things just, you know, randomly packed in together. Yeah, and quite a lot of graffiti had started appearing on the wall. So people were breaking in and adding graffiti, and an interesting where it happened, actually, a lot of it was in the office areas, not so much in the areas it would have been in.
Why did you think, Laura, that it continued till about 2016, 2017, you said? Well, why do you think that?
We found a lot of post letters that had been sent there, and also calendars. And the calendar was on a specific month in lots of different rooms. And it was definitely a couple of years later than was in the McAleese report. So I don't know if it was just a caretaker there and he kept that, but there was somebody there for a number of years after then the official date.
And do you suspect they were using the laundry during that period?
Yeah, like I don't know exactly what was going on. There was a few indicators that there was a different type of workforce there. So there was definitely people from Eastern Europe and from Asia who were working in the laundry, because we had some names that were put onto, you know, laundry containers. I also found a photograph of someone's hen night, which had, I think, the workers, you know, who had all went out for one of the women's hen nights. And it had a date on it as well, which was in the 2000s. So it was actually kind of nice as well that we got this indication of who was there afterwards. It wasn't just, you know, trying to search back and find things, but getting some sense of what's happened in the site over time. But
kind of refugees replacing the.
Yeah. Especially people who, you know, foreign labor, probably not getting paid very well, I'm guessing as well, because often those types of jobs are taken on, you know, whenever you had a free workforce beforehand, then you have to pay for them, then you want the cheapest labor generally. So
yeah, so you went from no paid to very low paid.
Exactly, yeah. And like, you know, we don't know the women who worked there after if they got paid either, you know, because they were still living in the convent next door. So I've never spoke to any of the women who did, but I know that there was a number who did.
Was that last photograph, Laura, was that still part of the modern extension?
Yeah, things have been moved around a lot, particularly when they went in to check the grounds. The archaeologists, I think they moved a lot of the stuff out into one part of into the old building is a Victorian era, so like 19th century building. And they'd moved everything in there, and then they moved it back again. And so by that stage, we just, the machines themselves hadn't moved because they're so heavy, but everything else had been moved around a number of times. I can show you some, like there's a couple of interesting things that I was quite surprised that it's been, existed for so long. I'm just getting this image up. I have so many pictures. So this was on one of the pillars in the room, which I find interesting. It still had the names, which had religious names. So the calendar room was with the main calendar where they would have used to feed bed sheets in. But these rooms were used for ironing, and they were called St. Anthony's and St. Bridget's. And they were, this was the main packing room we talked about. And it said here, yeah, section C, you are here. And it had the names of women on the back of it. So, there obviously were women who worked there. And at that stage, it was only women, and there were only Irish names. So we presume this is from the period that the laundry was being used, but it was still stuck on a pillar at the back of the room.
And the rooms that they never went to, they never were allowed into, was that on a different floor, or?
So there was some of these, like the canteen and the office rooms were here, and they wouldn't have seen those. So that's the ones we kind of brought them into. The upstairs they hadn't seen either. I think it might have been used for more sewing and things like that, but the women who I spoke to had never been upstairs. So again, we went upstairs to look at those rooms. And just, and this is like, again, this is like how much it was like a Magdalen laundry. Like these machines, they have the imprint on them. They were made in Glasgow in the 1930s and 1950s. Obviously the Sacred Heart, on top of this plinth, and this really ornate plinth, which had shamrocks on the side of it. But I loved how pragmatically it also had a fan there as well. So like the Sacred Heart was quite precarious on the side of this because the fan was obviously there to keep people cool. But I was just amazed that was still there, at this stage. And this was in 2018, that statue was still there.
Yeah. Did you get the impression that it was in good nick when it was being used? I mean, when it was well maintained?
Yeah, because there was a lot of, the kind of sleeves you would use on top of these, for the ironing. There was lots of those that were still unopened in packaging. There was a lot of, so one of the women, knew quite a lot about the laundry machines, and she said these were quite, they were obviously quite expensive machines. There had been some that had been replaced, but they were, they were expensive, high quality machines, and they were bought. And they were obviously the work people who had their own room in the structure. Were there to maintain them, and they had a lot of equipment, and they had a lot of, again, new parts that were still sitting there that weren't sold off afterwards. So they were still buying all this equipment even up to the very end.
Do you know who their clients were? Hotels and local stuff?
Yeah, hospitals, hotels, restaurants. Actually, I'll show you.
Artists on their throne, yeah.
I can show you that picture actually. There was and that's actually was one of the most fascinating, again, why I think the materials are so interesting, like how much they can encapsulate something in one small object. So there was cases and hampers which had the names of, the people who were obviously repeat clients. And there's Arsenic Phoenix Park, Dublin on that one there. And we also have High Park. So they were obviously back and forth between each other. This is Whitefriary Church. And then we just had normal, middle-class ladies' names on them as well. So it went the whole range. And we found some documentation that showed that they had ongoing connections to other laundries, to hospitals, and to restaurants and hotels, airports, UCD, the rugby club across the road, so all these big institutions had ongoing contracts with them up until the very end. Found lots of rugby equipment. There was lots of rugby tops and rugby shorts and stuff.
Of course, yeah, for the clubs, the teams.
Yeah.
But isn't that very telling? The suitcase for the park.
Yeah, awesome metro.
That was pretty. That was, it was one of the things that the developers knew were there, and they said to us, "So will you see this?" And I was like, "Wow!" You just wouldn't expect something that, that clear connection to the hierarchies was that obviously manifest. Which again is why I think materials again are so important. You always find something that you just wouldn't have found in a document that is just so clearly connects things. So
You certainly won't find them in the McAleese report anyway.
exactly. Because there's so few documents we're given, through that we can really access, that historians can look at and figure out what exactly is, going on. So, sometimes it's literally the object. So they're telling you this is the connections to these other places.
Well, that's very important, because it gives you an indication of the customers, and the questions will be raised. Did they know of the type of conditions and under which these people were working and living in these institutions? Because we know in the north that the laundries in the north obviously had the contract with the British and American armies during the Second World War, and of course a lot of the private contractors in the north were going absolutely ballistic about the fact that the religious orders could undercut all of the private contractors, obviously because they weren't paying the women.
Yeah.
Very good point, Ian. Was there any outcry about that? I mean, amongst people who ran laundries in Dublin? I mean,
one of the things we noticed, and I don't know when this started, again, because it's only the materials are telling me this, but what appears to have happened is that the laundries, the Magdalen laundries, were doing a lot of laundry for private laundries as well. So they had packaging from private laundries that they were using to put on top of stuff. So people would necessarily know, like they definitely knew if they had a case with, with the Magdalen laundry written on the front of it, but they were also getting their laundry done and it was going out in packaging from a private laundry. So I don't know how widespread that was, but those packaging were still there whenever, we went in 2018. So it was definitely ongoing, at the ends. But I'm pretty sure that would have, because when you're not paying for labor, like you must be undercutting everybody. So I can imagine that's what happened.
It's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
When I was a journalist in the 90s, 94, I was retracing Ulysses, the Bloomsday, the kind of the Joyce, and part of it takes part up near Sean McDermott Street, and I found myself in this yard with laundry sheets, huge amount of sheets, and I'll describe them as kind of childlike women, older women, older ladies, but sort of childlike, giggling and hiding behind the sheets and stuff. And I was like, what is this? And then this less childlike lady came out and screaming at me to get out. But it was the last days, I guess, of the Sean McDermott laundry.
Yeah, because it closed 96, so that would have been quite
96, this was in 94, 95,
I think that's, a lot of the stories I heard from the women, because again, one of the interesting things about the process of doing these oral, works on site is sometimes people were reacting to the site, but sometimes, like one of the things I found is that they were just refracting a lot through it. So some of the stories were about their childhood before they went in there. Some of the stories, what happened afterwards. So it was kind of a touchstone that moved back and forth, how did we get there? What happened afterwards? Which I found, particularly interesting. It wasn't just people were walking around going, oh, this is how that was used and this is what that was. It was much more of a, tying into their life story. And, just how much control was put on people, what they could do, what they could say. Like one of the women, just told us a story about how whenever they folded clothes, they were constantly having to recite the rosary and recite prayers because it stopped them being able to interact with each other in any way. So, and how after a while, the two women I spoke to were let out, and I think it sounded very much like, they hadn't quite broke their spirit and they didn't want them disrupting other women. So sometimes they were let out because they were seen as like not really, buckling down to the regime. And they, like one of them talked about constantly getting her hair cut up to both of them had got their hair cut up right up to the quick. And one of them said, well, the good thing about that was they couldn't really punish you that much anymore because whenever they cut your hair up, it had to grow a bit before they could cut it again. So yeah, it's just
the quick is what? It's just
like right up in.
Like you just have a little tuft then, would you?
Well, just like essentially like a buzz cut, like cut with all that. So I assume one of the reasons if they escape, people would know by looking at them. They probably got out of an institution. So so they had it was seen as it was a punishment for being, for stepping out of line or for doing something they weren't supposed to, which were often very, very, minor things. But it was kind of interesting sometimes just hearing the stories, the things that sounded very normal to them, I was like horrified at because they were awful, you know, how terrible the stories were. And they were like, oh yeah, of course, that's what happened. And then you were locked under the stairs, and then you didn't get any food for a couple of days. And, you know, this, and, you know, the pressure that other women put on them not to do anything bad because it had repercussions for all of them as well as for them. So it was, a lot of those sides were actually the most meaningful things, where they were just telling you something as a, oh yeah, of course. And I was, wow, okay. You know, the oppression that you just couldn't get from the objects either. Like those stories were so much more meaningful. And just, you know, the kind of cruelty I found about how often people were told that, you know, that they were worthless and not loved, and that's why they were there. Like that kind of emotional cruelty, I think, really stuck with me, particularly, you know, you could see it was still affected them even decades later, telling you those stories. You could hear the break in the voice, and, you know, having to say that to somebody, it was just quite painful to listen to, and I know for the person to say. So I think those kind of stories are so important that we record, because, you know, that's very much diminished how bad these experiences were, but I think that emotional cruelty was so important to remember, like how difficult that is for people to have to live with.
Rita often mentions the fact that like a lot of people in the mother and babies homes were still under the care of the nuns till they died. Really, I mean, they never escaped. They were institutionalized. Frank's mother or grandmother would have been one of those in Hyde Park.
Yeah, and in Galway Laundry, in the Magdalene home in Galway as well. You know, the women stayed there when they were in their retirement years, and Cope now occupy the rooms, which are really, really small rooms, where those women were, a tiny bedroom. And they would have been in receipt of a pension at that time, but they were institutionalized. And I even wonder, you know, we got a walk through when Cope, before it was redeveloped by Cope, and then afterwards to see the apartments that were there for domestic abuse victims. And walking through it, you wondered, you know, the building still held much of the iconography. And initially when we went in, like you, walking around it, you just felt, you know, the overwhelming feeling of oppression. You know, you knew that the women, and we were lucky enough to have a lady with us at one stage who had been in there as a young girl and who had escaped and is writing a book. She actually lives in Merview in Galway. And she was able to tell us that again, like you said, there were certain areas which they could not go to. They were told to pray regularly, they had to. But they could not go to the grotto because that's where it's on a hill. It's within the same area. It's only a short distance within eyesight. But they could not walk there because that's where the nuns were buried, and they weren't worthy of being on that part of the ground. So it's so important, I think, to remember all of these stories and the oppression, like you said, and what Patricia Burke-Broken has written about in Galway with the Eclipsed. I mean, she said that literally when she went there as a novice nun and didn't realize what she was getting into, and, you know, opened the door and then locked it behind her. And the women objected to doing the work. And she was the same age group as many of the young women, and she sat on the floor with them. And then without further ado, they got up and they just went back to their work. But she felt so much for them that she went to the Reverend Mother and asked what were they doing? You know, how could they do this? And of course, she said the walls actually bled, you know, they cried. It was like Dante's Inferno because the overwhelming heat and the sweat, it was just unbelievable. So I think that's what comes across from you as well, Laura.
Yeah, like it's again, that was an interesting thing walking around with the women, was just noticing how small most, you know, the women I met were. Like they were tiny, and that, you know, how big the machines were. I don't think we always take into account how difficult it was. So one of the women showed me, I'll see if I can bring this up. You know, again, things that you wouldn't really recognize unless it had been said. And that's why, again, I thought it was really worthwhile being there on the site. here's another. So this is the calendar machine, like how big they are. So a lot of the women ended up with scars because they're so hot, and like trying to get them, to make sure everything was fed through perfectly. Like absolutely huge machines. Also have asbestos in them. So like, they actually do anything, they have to be cleaned. And these are the bigger the big washing machines. But one of the things that she showed me was that they had to stand on these types of plinths to try and get inside the machines to get the stuff in and out, because they were too small to be able to lift material out of the machines themselves. So, and like, again, we would have just went, oh yeah, that's just like whatever, a blue crate. Like, you wouldn't have known how it was being used. And I think it really gets home to you how difficult it is, how physical that labor is as well, when you realize that people can't even get into the machine with their own body. They have to use other equipment to be able to do that. So I thought that was quite, powerful, just having that discussion and going, when you can see someone against the machines, you can go, yeah, they're like, how does anybody be able to use those whenever you're a little tiny, person, even now. But I'm sure back in the day, like, the woman was no more than 5 foot. Like, there's just no way you would be able to use those machines easily, especially for the time scale they had to do it.
It's amazing also that it's in such a well-to-do area, surrounded by judges and, the great and the good, who are obviously getting their sheets cleaned there as well. Like, I imagine. Union talks often about the Northern Ireland situation, and it is different, and in terms of your line of work, have they advanced further? I know that the disappeared are very much a focus of interest up in the north, but in terms of this area.
Like, I'm sure Union would have a lot more comments than I do about this, but I find it interesting. Like, I grew up in Belfast, and my family come from West Belfast, from a kind of working class background. And I have stories then about, well, interestingly, and this is funny, again, coming from Northern Ireland, the things that are said and not said, I think, are always quite important in families. But like my grandmother, her father was an English Protestant, so we were kind of you have that tone of not being completely beholden to the Catholic Church. So I had a granny who brought up a lot of cousins and things who came in from different places, and a lot of that was to do with they wouldn't really engage with the church. They didn't want their involvement with stuff. And my mum says she remembers that her mum went out and shouted at nuns who were hitting kids behind, railings and stuff like that. She, she just said, she wasn't afraid of them, other people were. But I think that's because our background was like not to be, kind of afraid of the nuns. But she said even when she grew up, she was told, oh, if you're bold, you're going to get sent to the laundry. And like, that was the threat that people had, growing up, and knowing that you lived in those areas where those laundries were such a presence. Like, there's such a big presence, even when they're hidden behind walls, they're there, and that you can see, the women passing around. So like, I think though it's kind of been ignored a lot more than has been, the situation in the Republic of Ireland. Because there's been because the traumas of the Troubles have taken over a lot of those discussions about traumas of the past. But like, I really think, there needs to be a lot more acknowledgement of what happened there, and to engage with the material remains of these places before they disappear and before they're disappeared, essentially. I found this a lot doing work with the Maze Prison and doing work with laundries in the South, that there seems to be a little bit of an implicit process of ruination. Just let things get bad enough that we don't really have to do anything with it. The Maze, when I did studies there, whenever I went around the site, they were often the windows were left open and the doors were left open. There was obviously a process of just letting nature take its course. And I was really wary of how that happens. That's a very easy thing to do. Let things get ruined and then you don't have to save them. I'm really conscious of that in terms of how we remember these things moving forward, that we have to keep some of these sites. What about this? Actually, sorry,
sorry, I beg your pardon, Laura, but do you think, like Marion Vale, where Union was born, do you believe any site that we can preserve now should be preserved, or what? I mean, what do you think should happen to these sites?
Yeah, like I think there definitely needs to be more than one site retained. Like we can't keep all of them, but we have to keep important ones, particularly ones where there's enough left that we can do stuff with that. So like definitely, I know there's buildings still left in Marion and I've said to Ewan I'd like to go and have a look at them with him because again, I'm used to looking at these buildings and figuring out, what can we do with this? I was really compelled by Sean McDermott Street because I've been in there a few times,
Have you?
because yeah, like the laundry, the industrial laundry was, knocked down after there was a fire there in the 90s, seemed rather excessive to knock the whole thing down. But, the outside of it is still in the walls. You can still see the footprint of it is still in the ground as well. You can see exactly where parts of that laundry were. And whenever I last got in, which was in September, there's still a miniature laundry in the women's quarters. So there's still laundry machines and a small remnant of a laundry. And like, that's just to me is the most important thing that they need to keep from that site, like the church and the convent, whatever. Because the problem is you keep the buildings of power, you remember the stories of power. So over time, you forget the stories of the people who were victims and who were placed in those. So I think it's so important in terms of the buildings that we retain. It has to be the buildings that reflect the women and their stories, not just, here's a couple of buildings on the site. Like where are the dormitories, where are the buildings people worked in? Those are the ones that need to be kept.
Would you think that would be a good site, the Sean McDermott, for a museum of some kind of?
It's super important because, there's so few sites left in the Republic of Ireland now. A lot of them have been transitioned into other things or they've been knocked down. And, Donnybrook's already been given planning permission. And, one of my just thoughts, I had to think quite a lot about whether I did the work on that site because, again, if you're working with developers in the planning process, you're facilitating them, turning these sites into something else. Yeah. But, looking at those two sites, Donnybrook is in a middle class area outside of the town. There's only the industrial elements left. There's no dormitories, there's no convent building. The Sean McDermott Street is much more complete in terms of what you can do with it. It's in a neighborhood, a community that is much more meaningful where it is. And it could be part of the process of, some form of transitional justice that you could begin to think about how does this site not just represent the past, but how does it transition the community and people, with it. It's one of the reasons, I became interested in these as sites of conscience as much as anything else. Like there's, a lot of problems with some of these ideas because they can seem very idealistic and, in practice, they have to be sustainable in some way. They have to be able to support themselves. But I think having those different options of them being sites of memory, but also active sites of justice as well is really important, that it has a present and future orientation. And because there's so much of that site, up, which is not got anything on it essentially because so much of it was knocked down, there's a lot you could do there that would give it a lot of different uses and different meanings, but also connect to what it was in the past. So for me, it's the most meaningful site really in the Republic of Ireland anyway. I'd like to see the ones in the north a bit more because I've only been to Ormeau Road and I've seen the convent there, but I haven't seen the site in Uri.
Yeah. What would you do with sort of, you've got a place like, say, Besburg, where commercial development, they want to introduce commercial development. I know, was that on the cards in Donnybrook, or is that on the cards? I know that Sean McDermott Street has been saved, doesn't it, by the council?
At the minute, the council owns Sean McDermott Street, and there's a lot of pressure for them to do something with it. But really, you would think the government should own that site. It should be taken into the government, I think, because it should be left to a city council to be looking after that. It's an important site. I should say also around the artifacts in between it. So one of the things I did in Donnybrook was contact the National Museum to make sure they kept a collection of material, which, I met a really, brilliant curator, Brenda Malone, who had done work around the Repeal the 8th as well. And they were very into contemporary collecting. And said to her, I really want you to see this site and I want to see what we can, what can be saved for the national collection, because that also shapes, Irish memory is what's in the National Museum. So it's not just the buildings, also the objects. And so she's still in the process of taking, they've taken quite a lot of stuff and they're going to take, more stuff, which I think is really important. Like one of the things we found out when doing, work on women from the Civil War period is sometimes it's hard to tell their stories because there's so little material saved from them. So, you know, and that's something we've discussed whenever I've talked about coming in jail. You know, we can't tell people stories when we don't have their, you know, we don't have stuff, we don't have materials, we don't have buildings. So that's really important to be proactive and think about, this is about the national memory. So we need to keep this and make sure that it's displayed as well as retained.
Could I suggest a suitcase that they could have as an exhibit at the?
That is one of the. That is definitely a keeper. That is in the National Museum already. So.
And yeah, God, a lot of those things, the machines could be. You could have an exhibition of some kind, couldn't you? To showing all that, it's fascinating just even seeing it.
Yeah, like they've tried to take quite a big collection actually, and quite big stuff as well. And what I have to say about the developers, they have facilitated everything and they have funded it as well, which is really good. You know, so they've taken that responsibility, you know, properly. And I'm still in contact with them. They still facilitate me getting access to the site too, which I want to keep reporting. So like they have actually been really good at doing what they promised they would do, which doesn't always happen. As soon as people get planning permission, often, you know, they're a little less helpful, but they haven't been in this case. They've been pretty good. And they've let us, you know, they've let the National Museum take anything they wanted. So there was no stopping any of that, which is really good.
And if you go to a place like Marionvale, is it? Marionvale. How do you go about it? Like, say if you just, like a detective, is it? You just sort of snoop around and skirting boards and whatnot. And what do you look for?
Like, it's funny. I've got, you know, because I've done quite a few different institutional sites, like you get a little bit more intuitive with it. But it's so important to be in the place. Like, I think it's so important in terms of going to sites like that you just really, like, you go in having an expectation. It's good to do some research. What kind of buildings are there? Do you know what period they're from? But I am so aware of, like, don't try and over, you know, predict what's going to be there. You have to be really open to seeing things that you weren't expecting, or else you'll just not notice them. Yeah. So that's what I really want to see. Actually, I'll just want to show you one more thing, which I think is quite interesting, in terms of things that, you know, we find on the site. So, and again, this is why I think it's really important working with survivors who want to do the, you know, who want to be involved. So I found this bell, which, you know, was a homemade bell. This is a big, you know, a big bolt essentially with wire around it, and then there seems to be some kind of washer tied inside it. So it must have been a bell, you know, they used in the hall. So I left it on the site, you know, and said, okay, we'll come and collect this. And someone stole this in between the first visit to the site at Donnybrook and the second. So I only have this photograph, which makes me very sad. I got very much more, okay, just take stuff if you know it's there, because someone, you know, can just break onto the site and steal it.
It's annoying, isn't it? Yeah.
It was heartbreaking. Actually, they stole all the sinks as well. I don't know what that was about, but all the sinks disappeared over a summer. So this just sitting in the main room I showed you, which was the sorting room, and it just looks like a nondescript piece of furniture. We'd already looked at it and thought, well, you know, it looks old, so we'll probably keep it, you know, but we're not really sure what it's for. But it was only one of the survivors walked past it, went, oh, that's a bedside table, and I was like, oh, I'd not really looked at it because there was just a huge collection of furniture. And what she had noticed was, you know, this ring on the top would have been from the jug and ur that would have held the water bowls. And so again, you've got this little patina of how this was used. You know, it's a nondescript, pretty, you know, mundane piece of furniture, but it was the only thing we found in Donnybrook that it was associated with the domestic quarters of the women. So we were glad we would keep it anyway, but it was really good to have that, you know, affirmation of, well, this is actually quite important. This is something we need to keep. So that's, again, another piece that was taken in by the National Museum. So.
And what were their quarters like? Were they in dormitories or?
Yeah, so the dormitories had been knocked down at Donnybrook, so they were knocked down after the nuns had sold the site, and they had built another kind of a nursing home essentially. I've seen the dormitories in Sean McDermott Street, and similar to what Brita said, they're very small rooms, and there's very little material in them now. There was just, some of them had beds and maybe a little bedside table. There was a couple of pictures and things like that. And they're, you know, it's very dark looking rooms as well. So the ones we had seen were on the ground floor, because the upper floors had so much debris, like there was trees growing through them. And again, that made me quite conscious of that we need to do something with this site, because, you know, if it's not secured, then that's just going to get worse and worse. But the ground floor was pretty accessible. Rooms were small. There was a couple of communal rooms for the women, and then the laundry was at the bottom. There were some really scary looking religious statues that nearly gave me a heart attack in the dark. There was one in an alcove that was like the scariest looking thing I've ever seen. I actually screamed whenever I seen it. But you know, but they're again all still there. I was kind of surprised. You know, the nuns had sold off a lot of stuff, but they left their religious statues in the alcoves. So
yeah, it shows how much it meant to them, you know.
That's what we said. It's interesting they didn't take any of those.
Isn't it? Laura, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but it's been so absorbing and really compelling. Breda, did you want to get a word in? From me, anyway.
I think it's fantastic. I think we learn so much from these type of talks. And, you know, when we cannot have the survivors here themselves telling the stories, to have Laura to reflect, you know, what she has heard, in the same way that, you know, when we hear the stories, I say it time and again, the one thing that always gets people stopping, you know, is a survivor telling their own story. It doesn't matter how many times we hear it. If it's the same story again and again, it does not matter, because each time we hear it, it stops us in our tracks. And that is what has changed the entire country, I think, and the young people to come behind survivors. And that's why today we see the minister looking to Europe to tell us that, yes, the survivors are entitled to their own documentation. It's not before time. They should have had it long ago. But things are changing for the better. And Laura, it's wonderful to have you, and hopefully we'll have you back again for.
Yeah, please. It'll be fantastic.
I was just going to say that the oral histories were given to the museum as well. So when they interpret those objects, they have those stories to go alongside them, because again,
but they don't have the bell.
No, very sad.
It may turn up. It may turn up, Laura.
Yeah, no, I was wondering about who's taking stuff. Actually, it might be people trying to save things. Hopefully. So.
Yeah, we might put out an appeal for the bell tomorrow when we post this show. And I just want to say very, very sorry for all the technical difficulties before the show. I'll masters in one day. Dr. Laura McCatney, Una Duffy, and Breda Murphy, and myself, John. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, John. Thanks, Breda. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Laura.
No problems. Are we still on? Are we off? Or...
Yeah, I don't know what's happening here. It's just locked us in a room. That was really good. Thanks very much. It's brilliant getting different people on, and especially, you know, your whole mindset and approach to archaeology and the connection between the peoples. You know, it's so important at the end of the day. Even the archaeology and the transitional justice, the social justice. You know, people talk about transitional justice always as like a post-conflict, post-trauma sort of thing, but it has to be brought into the now, I think, and part of the process all the time, you know.
Yeah, totally agree. Like, you know, it has to be used whenever there's stuff. You know, there's people still here, and we're still, you know, dealing with the stuff. We can't just kind of wait for like decades and then see what happens. So,
well, the physical structures are so. See if you go into Marianville, and hopefully we will at some point. I mean, you'll see the room divided up into 4 partitioned rooms with just stud walls with an open ceiling, obviously. And I mean, that gives people, when you get there and you see that, that's the whole visualization of something where if you can't get that oral testimony, you just have to walk in, and then you can start to imagine and visualize, oh my God, well, these women actually they had to live like this, you know?
No, totally. Like, I think the places are so important. They're so evocative. Like, people can begin to sense what it is. Like, it's different reading something, or, you know, being in the place actually really brings home to you, oh, this is what the experience was, which I think, you know, you can't do unless there's some places left that let us do that, you know, where we can actually go, this must have been terrible. Because I think it's very easy to explain things away whenever it's left to documents and, you know, not much else, where I think that the buildings themselves are actually quite powerful in transmitting that. So.
Oh, absolutely. I wonder, are we still live on YouTube here? Are you getting that at the top as well?
Yeah. Right. So I'll leave. Nice to see you.
Thanks again. Take it easy.